Good evening, everyone. I'm Josh Graf-Zivin. I'm the director of the Center on Global Transformation. I'm delighted that all of you could be with us this evening. I just want to start with a couple of sentences about CGT for those of you that don't know us, and then I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, John Alquist, who is running the seminar series that you have all joined us for this evening. The Center on Global Transformation is a center at UCSD based in the School of Global Policy and Strategy that is focused on the ways in which science and technology are intersecting with policy to transform our economic and political lives around the globe. We support lots and lots of activities on the research front, on the conference front. We have a distinguished visitors series that John may tell you a sentence or two about. And we are just delighted that you could all join us here for this evening's exciting panel discussion from our distinguished guests. John, let me pass the microphone to you.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And I'd like to extend a broad welcome to all our guests as well as our audience tonight on these virtual events. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the day when the events are no longer virtual. So with that in mind, let me just say a couple quick words about the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program, which is the program I run and that is putting on the event tonight. So the Pacific Leadership Fellows Program is part of the Center on Global Transformation that Josh just mentioned. And it's really at the core of the center's mission. Typically what we do in the normal times or the before times is we host fellows from around the world to come to San Diego for a period of days. And these are dynamic thought leaders from business, from government and policy, from the academic communities. In the last few years, since 2006, we've hosted over 101 fellows from 24 countries. And in fact, one of our interlocutors this evening, former Ambassador Nirupama is a former fellow. So we hope that these visits build long-term connections between the San Diego region, UCSD, and GPS with people around the world. It's also, I want to say a couple of quick words to acknowledge our supporters and funders. So really none of this would have been possible without the generous and continuing support from Joan and Erwin Jacobs. So I want to acknowledge them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Gaurav Khanna, who is going to be emceeing tonight's conversation. And he's going to kind of lay out the ground rules for how we're going to proceed this evening.
Thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who's joining us, from different parts of the world. I'm Gaurav Khanna, a professor here at GPS. I'm a development economist and a labor economist working on, among other things, high-scale migration to the US. So I'm particularly excited to really moderate this panel. We're delighted to have Ambassador Rao join us today. She's had a long, storied career and probably has a lot of great stories to share with us as a result. Decade-long diplomatic career, she's probably held a possible important post in India, including India's first woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, India's first woman ambassador to China, and was and still is one of the leading experts on Indo-China relations. Ambassador Rao is also India's second woman foreign secretary, which is the top diplomat and administrative head of India's Ministry of External Affairs. And following that, she was appointed as India's ambassador to the US in Washington, D.C., at which point she helped oversee the growth of important sections of the Indo-US strategic partnership. So there's a lot there, and she's also an avid writer and columnist. So thank you, Ambassador Rao, for joining us today. We also have Bill Kerr joining, Professor Bill Kerr. We're really delighted to have him. He's a professor at Harvard Business School. Bill is really a leading academic expert on immigration, innovation, entrepreneurship. He also works companies and advises governments about investments in innovative capacities. His research focuses a lot on how businesses grow through innovation and globalization. And in his many publications, he's looked at things like global ventures, immigrant talent clusters. Bill's recent book, Gift of Global Talent, we highly recommend to you all, and describe how immigration has transformed US innovation, reshaped the US economy through the rise of these talent clusters, and really influenced the US society more broadly in many ways. So he argues that the US can get a lot more of the global talent flows with some immigration reform. So thank you again, Bill, for joining us today. So our plan today is to really allow Ambassador Rao and Kerr to first share a few thoughts about the topic at hand today on high-skilled migration in the US. After which I'll ask you questions to help with the discussion. In the meantime, as audience members, you all should also feel free to use the Q&A box to share any questions that you may have, and I'll try and bring those into the discussion in the last 15 to 20 minutes of our. So let's start off with some opening remarks. Dr. Rao would be delighted if you could start us off.
Thank you, Gaurav, and thank you all at the UCSD for inviting me to participate in this panel today. I live in Bangalore, India. It's 7:30 in the morning, so it's really, I should be saying good morning to all of you. Bangalore, as you know, is at the heart of the information technology industry here in India, and it's seen around the world as India's so-called Silicon Valley. But it's quite different from your Silicon Valley in the United States. It has its own Indian touch and Indian characteristics. Let me start by saying that I'm not an expert on the issue, but I have had the pleasure and privilege of speaking to some leading experts here in the field in Bangalore. And what I'm going to say to you is based on those conversations I've had with them. The IT industry in India took off in the 1990s, as you know. Jack Welch asked, in fact, famously, what is it I can take back from India? And he said, and I quote, "Let me take back software." And he was a pioneer in setting up the offshore development centers here. And thus, with the turn of a small switch, data that was in India went back to the US, and it helped the 24-hour workday cycle also. In those days, it was the B visa that people used to go to the United States. The H visas were not spoken of so much. But the US government from 1992, 1993 clamped down on this. They felt it was cheap labor coming into the US, and tax issues arose. And so people started using the H visa. And those days, the H visa was seen by many of the H visa holders from India as a path to a green card and citizenship, the technological migration path. And in 1994, the Twitch companies, as we call them, Tech Mahindra, Wipro, Infosys, Tata Consulting Services, Cognizant, and HCL started applying for the H and L visas, the L visa being the intra-company transfer visa. And these were typically 6 to 7 year visas, extendable by 1 term. And many were jumping onto the green card bandwagon. The US obviously was an attractive destination. And for engineers from India who were paid far less here in this country, you ended up making $24,000 to $25,000 a year, which was far more than what you got in India. And as a lighter aside, software engineers enjoyed a great premium on the marriage market. And spouses were not allowed to work in the US on their H-4 visas as dependents. But as far as women were concerned, young brides from India were quite independent in the United States, and they were happy even if they weren't working. And usually the deterrent to bringing back the engineer to India was from the wife's side. Independence was the name of the game. And of course, the other set of people who went to the United States, apart from the software engineers, were the MBAs who went there for consulting jobs, and they were often from the best institutions in India also. Now, did many of these people come back? Some of them did, especially to companies like Infosys and Wipro, which offered stock options. And there was the attraction of coming back for senior level roles, which were not there in the US. And so there was reverse migration. And some countries like Canada also tried to attract high-skilled workers from India, saying that the spouses could work. Now, currently, H-1B visas, as you all know, are capped at, I believe, 65,000. India gets 65 to 70% of these. And there are also another 20,000 visas, H-1B visas, for people who hold US degrees. But the Trump administration insistence on high salaries for those coming, level 4 wages, as they're called, for H-1B visas was a great dampener. Today, if you ask me, there are about 350,000 people from India in the US who are on H-1B visas. And Indian students in the US may total around 200,000. This is just a rough estimate, I may be wrong. Now, there's a lot of hiring that Indian companies do in the United States, but the fungibility and the brightness that you get from Indian professionals is important because the best and brightest go from here. And their ability to diversify and literally jump technologies is also very good. And that's why you find Google and Microsoft fighting for increasing the H1 cap so that they can get more people from India. So H1L visas will continue to be needed. Now, what are the challenges? Trump was bringing in a very high entry barrier, President Trump, through the salary you needed to pay for H1B visas. And it was literally killing the market. Now, whatever happens, the numbers of engineers India churns out, the United States cannot match. There's a huge talent pool here, and the creme de la creme goes to the United States, which is an advantage for the US. The negotiation is about that now. What is the salary cap going to be? The quality and the numbers in the US will not be there for cutting edge professionals. India churns out almost 1.5 to 2 million engineering graduates a year. And if you don't permit those studying in STEM disciplines, Indian students studying in the US, to work after they graduate, then the attraction of studying in the US also will diminish. And it's not good for the US industry also. Where will industries that rely on Indian talent really look? Now, if you look at the various heads of tech firms in the US today who are Indian, Arvind Krishna of the IBM, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, Sundar Pichai of Google, Shantanu Narayan of Adobe, Nikesh Arora of Palo Alto Networks, their success is as much a tribute to their Indian origins as it is to what is right about America. And English language skills that they bring are also important, where China's scores in that field is much lower. And India has a rich tech culture too. So the question is, what is President Biden going to do on this whole issue? And how much can India push back? Now, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, has taught us a lot of lessons. In companies like Infosys, 99% of people are working today from home. So why do you want to send people abroad is the question. So then they may just keep most of their workers here and send just a tiny sliver of people abroad. Of course, legal compliances also have to be managed. Now, India, unlike China, was not able to bring back talent from the United States to develop hardware capabilities. China, of course, marshals its troops better, but software has been our strength. Nonetheless, Corona has changed things, and you may have a situation where companies may not even file learnings from the pandemic, so to say. Outsourcing opportunities remain quite a few. There's a high demand for our software professionals. Pure science in India is not so strong. We have this mad craze for engineering, especially computer engineers. Civil engineers have become dinosaurs. The IT industry cannot absorb all the engineers that we churn out every year. So in many ways, also the work ethic in India has to change. Hands of employers cannot be tied. Hire and fire policies should be there. We have huge numbers of holidays which cut into work hours. China worked 10 to 15 hours a day in the early phases. So hard calls need to be made in India. For example, in America, even funerals happen on Saturdays or Sundays. I can't imagine that happening here. So the work ethic in India mixes and matches holidays, and that affects productivity. If we partner with the United States, we can do much in technology, like we did in Y2K, like the US embraced Indian IT in a big way. So the United States obviously has to tap this talent. So partnerships are worth pursuing. Technology has changed so much in the world. Software is eating all of us. And the move to cloud and application programming interface actually underscores the need for onshore developers, makes it much less important from the tech perspective. Now, unfortunately, our politics is moving in an opposite direction. The license for Infosys or Wipro seems to hinge on some kind of local hiring, and they don't actually need developers in the United States. They're going to view the offshore presence as a tax being levied on them. India now has the same switching costs as China has in manufacturing. I'm talking of in software. Now, India is the only place where you can get off a plane and hire 1,000 Hadoop programmers in a week. And as I said, we produce about 1.2 to 2 million engineers a year. So we've created a people supply chain for services and now products and captives. IBM and Accenture have almost the same number of employees today in India as Infosys and TCS. The biggest development is in the 800 captives that have been set up here in India. For example, Robert Bosch, the German company, has 22,000 people writing software in India and only 4,000 people doing manufacturing. Daimler-Benz has 8,000 people writing software and only 2,000 people making cars in India. So the biggest thing that has happened in the last 5 years is these captive software centers. The first was GE, and now JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs have their biggest employee base outside the US in India. And they're only writing software. JP Morgan has 21,000 employees in India. Goldman Sachs has 8,000. And JP Morgan India is actually taking away business from Infosys and giving it to JP Morgan India. So every company has concluded that every company in India is also a technology company. And this is the spiritual, if you can call it, and the intellectual insight of the last 5 years. It's like Apple saying that I can send manufacturing to China. Apple is now concluding that I cannot send software to China, but I can send it to India. But they're not sending it to Infosys or Wipro, they're sending it to Apple India. So this is the trend in the last 5 years towards captives or global development centers. H-1B visas may have seen a peak in India, for India, but in our country, IT professionals now at about 4.5 million will continue to increase to about 10 million. That's the calculation. The digitization super cycle of COVID has expanded the addressable market for services, products, or captives. In the US, of course, the 350,000 H-1Bs that we have will peak because obviously you don't want to give more. And perhaps in India, we don't want it either because it's expensive to send people there. But IT is an oasis of high productivity in India. It's 0.8% of India's labor force today, but it generates 8% of GDP. You compare it to agriculture, which is 40% of labor force and just 14% of GDP. So the impact of the IT industry going from 4 million to 10 million has huge externalities for the Indian economy, for the labor markets, for skilling system, for education. As I said, we have the switching costs that China has in manufacturing. And if services companies, Indian services companies, migrate to products, which is a big if today, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the new technology world of cloud, it'll make it easier for our companies who are in services to cross to products. And that's why, for instance, an Indian company like TCS's market cap is more than Accenture. Indian companies are migrating fast to the digital world, and they're migrating from services, which was cost plus labor, to what we call the digital world, which is a value minus product world. So in the US-India corridor, as I said before, the biggest development is this captive model. We have 800 centers, global development centers in India. And it's very confusing politically. They're not Indian companies. It's like Apple setting up companies in India. So the big name is really these global development companies, which find India attractive from the human capital perspective, and also because of the increasing antipathy and the reaction to China. And it's a 5x Y2K moment for India recently. And the market cap of our companies like TCS and Infosys just shows that. Every company is putting digital at the heart of their strategy. And how is the trajectory going to be in the next few years? It's going to be interesting, not only because of our companies, but the subsidiaries that the US companies are creating in India. Today, because of hardware being made in China, a large part of embedded software is also being done there. But if you decide to diversify from Chinese hardware, then the embedded software development is a no-brainer. It'll have to be done in India. And therefore, people are not running away from India. Perhaps they're running towards India because of the phenomenal people supply chain that we have. As I said, hiring 1,000 Hadoop programmers in a week is just the normal activity here. And nobody in the world has the inventory or the capacity like India. It's a virtuous cycle. Nobody can replicate what we have in Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, or Pune, or Gurugram. It's not been replicated elsewhere. How do you see the Indian IT industry developing? I should end shortly. I see it also becoming a real big ally for the Indian military and defense industry in the next 5 to 10 years. Data capabilities, facial recognition capabilities, cyber warfare capabilities. It's like the space program was for our missile program. The supply side is there. The demand side has to get its act together. So I also wanted to mention that 20% of IT company hires today are in India are from non-IT related fields, non-engineering graduates who, we require design skills, communication skills. So the user interface, user experience, which is really the essence of cloud, doesn't require code writers, but different kinds of skills. And this is another innovation, diversifying for different skills, and we can provide that. I also wanted to say, perhaps US Congress, there's a message for US Congress here. People in the US who want visas denied to Indian professionals may be fighting yesterday's war. There was a time when the binding constraint for the Indian IT industry was H-1B visas, and the lack of cloud put emphasis on on-prem software rather than the cloud. So in the on-prem world, these people who didn't want H-1B visas to be increased wielded huge power. But today, work from home means work from anywhere. This concept of I will not let you in my country becomes less of a threat and less relevant than it used to. So in America, they will have to decide where renewal comes for within America. So I know that technology is a huge part of the genuine fear arising from the rise of China, and that a balkanization of international supply chains is a real possibility. And India is caught between these two worlds, but I think it will tend to the Western technology mode. And while the pandemic has had a negative impact on physical supply chains, it has had a positive impact on service supply chain. So you see an acceleration of the globalization of services that can be delivered on a wire. And this will only accelerate as people are increasingly familiarized with remote work within the US and also across the borders. So this is the dispersal of talent. So H-1B visas are going to change irreversibly. And so that is really the situation, perhaps something we couldn't have imagined a year, even a year, perhaps even in early 2020. So let me end by saying that Infosys, an Indian company, has hired 13,000 people in the US in the last 3 years, and another 12,000 hires maybe on the anvil. So they are creating jobs in the United States. But the real action today is here. The great possibilities and prospects for bilateral Indo-US trade in technology, which can enhance also bilateral security and strategic arrangements, which are such an important component of the relationship today. So, somebody like Paula Stern has suggested a bilateral US-India IT sector agreement, which would benefit many other sectors, including defense, flow of people, banking, aerospace, S&T, that's science and technology, and infrastructure, among others. And cooperation in cybersecurity is another area. And within US, India, Japan, and Australia, maybe we should work apart from doing military exercises and discussing defense and security matters arising from the rise of China. We should work on strengthening and advancing trade policies consistent, trade and technology policies consistent with geostrategic positions and our democratic principles. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Rao. That was extremely insightful. Thanks. Bill, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Great. And thank you to Joshua and John and Gaurav and the rest of the team for inviting me. And Ambassador Rao's and the sweeping set of statements that cut all across geopolitics. There's a hard act to follow. So I'm just going to kind of more stay in my lane here for a little bit and maybe start with a little bit more background on myself. How did I even get involved in thinking about global talent flows? I started first and foremost working on topics around US innovation and entrepreneurship. And it was in that context that you look around at the world of invention, the world of the Apple that was just described, or what is the composition of Kendall Square near the Boston area. And you quickly start to realize the impact that foreign talent has had on our country. So what I want to maybe do to set up a little bit of our side of this thought process is just share some perspectives or a few more additional kind of data points, trends that speak to the impact that India has had in the US. And then we can maybe open it up and try to navigate around this. And I'll kind of start with a little bit of the punchline. It's had a very large and beneficial impact. That's not going to be so surprising. But I think as we talk a little bit about some of the numbers and we think about some of the deeper implications, there are some surprising things. But then I'll try to, as I go through it, introduce some of the tensions that exist and surface them up as a way for us to think about where the ball is heading next. So a really important kind of beginning point is just to appreciate in the US context, what do the numbers mean? Like when you talk about the Indian contributions to innovation, how large is it? And how many STEM workers and so forth are involved? And if you go back to, say, 1970, about 1% or a little bit less of STEM workers in the United States were Indian. This is science, technology, engineering, mathematics, writ large, includes computer programming and similar. And roughly about 1% or a little bit less of the invention that happened inside of the US, so domestic inventors, were people that we would have classified as being ethnically Indian. And we don't, in the long span of historical data, I'm getting pretty wonkish here, but in the long span of historical data, we don't know country of birth exactly, but we would, for example, take Ambassador Rao's name, take Gaurav's name, and be able to discern that they are more likely to be ethnically Indian than Bill Kerr. So it's a very simple kind of technique, but you have patents that go through all of this era that you're able to then document and look at some of these impacts. Well, from that starting point in 1970, there's been, not surprisingly, a rapid growth to where our best estimates are today around 8 to 9% of invention in the United States has an ethnically Indian inventor that's behind it. And the same is a roughly comparable number in terms of occupation counts looking in the STEM fields. And so this sort of seems like it's a lot about the talent that's come. It's kind of punching at its weight class in terms of the impact for innovation space. And not surprisingly, when you go and break this down into technology fields, you find a lot of predominance around ICT sectors. When you go look at parts of the country that are, closest connected into this, there's going to be more coastal cities and traditional Indian hubs. And Ambassador Rao also highlighted earlier the role of the numbers of students coming to America from India. And in the latest data I have, it's about 17% of foreign students in America are from India, second only to China in terms of that impact. So it's very clear, however you want to cut this, whatever angle you take on it, these trends have been doing like this, upward sloping kind of growing impact. And sometimes I like to reflect with somebody, we're not using slides today, but if you saw these trends and you saw these increases, I'd reflect that across those 45 years or so that we're able to map, a heck of a lot of stuff has happened. You've had the various technology changes. First off, really the PC coming to play. Then you had the Y2K. Then you had the internet emerges. All the stuff that's kind of followed on. You've also during that period of time had unfortunate recessions. You've had wars that have been involved. You had 9/11. There's a bunch of stuff that has been thrown at that. And that relationship to date has been one that's been a continual long-term kind of rise in this. But there's even some deeper things that I think the US, and particularly I work at a business school, so from a business perspective, you start to identify with how India, and I'm going to throw in China for the next statistic because their combined impact is really powerful here. How they have been changing some of the ways that innovation happens in America, some of its locations, some of kind of what we think was like the rise of these tech clusters in the US that have become so powerful. And the Gaurav was kind enough to mention my book a little bit earlier. I think the most striking statistic that people circle when they talk about the book is the one that really thinks about the impact that global talent has had on the rise of Silicon Valley and the San Francisco area more broadly. So if you go back to 1975, which is when our data really get underway, at that time, about 1 in every 220 patents in America had an Indian or Chinese inventor or co-inventor living in the Silicon Valley, San Francisco area as a part of that patent, which was probably enough to get like a local news article or something, but it really wasn't in the grand scheme of US invention like this mesmerizing fact. Today, that number is about 1 out of every 11 patents. So 1 out of every 11 patents that the US is currently producing has an Indian or Chinese inventor living in the Bay Area as being a part of it. And it's helpful to pause and try to understand, what does 1 out of 11 mean? And the best way I've come to kind of visualize is if you start with the state in America that has the least patenting, it's often like North Dakota or Alaska, a relatively small state. And you add in the second least, third least, fourth least, and you're kind of going up that scale. You have to put 28 states from the bottom in place before you get to what 1 out of 11 patents means. And so again, reframing that slightly, these two global talent groups, they're not the only two, of course, but they're by far the two biggest that are impacting US innovation. These two forms of global talent in one supercluster are now producing half of the innovations that, are the equivalent of what in land mass is about half of our country is producing. And that's got some strong power to it. It helps to understand why every business leader has been trying to understand what is happening in the Valley, or what's happening in Boston or in Austin, Texas, or how do we get a part of those types of locations. And it's also had, I'm sure, even more global impacts. I've never been able to try to substantiate this, but if you think about Nokia's competition in the mobile phone space, the ability of the Androids and the Apples and the platforms on the West Coast to connect into global talent surely had to play some role in this. Ambassador Rao also introduced kind of the captive centers abroad. And one other thing that we see as a striking feature of global innovation today that was practically never true, historically, is that about 1 in every 8 patents that are produced in the United States have an inventor in the United States that's on the patent and have someone abroad that is co-inventing the patent with them. So the rise of cross-border teams has become very prominent, and a lot of that happens both within companies and also along ethnic lines. So that there's deeper connections into the Apple Center that is in India is probably linked in some way to what is happening in Cupertino, and those are being connected. Now, of course, I want to just open this up very quickly and get the conversation moving. There are challenges here. The unfortunate way that I open my book is to look at one issue of Business Week. And the issue was from it's like 2017, I think if I got the date right, May of 2017. And the cover story of that was this very sad tale of a town in Kansas, Olathe, Kansas, that had built up a IT community with a bunch of Indian talent. And Garmin was one of the local, which makes GPS, was one of the local companies in that space. And an enraged white male in his 50s stormed into a bar and yelled, "Get out of my country." And he shot at 2 of the Indians. And he unfortunately killed one of the tech programmers. And the article then goes on to describe and kind of appreciate how similar kinds of violence and tension had arisen in other parts of the country, as well as in other countries around the world, around kind of the populist movement and some of the questions about global integration. And I do that because not only was that a very poignant start to the book, but if you had actually opened it up and then looked in the table of contents, there were like 14 other articles that were related to global talent. And so I'm trying to go through those articles and say, in this one issue of Business Week, you have a lot here. And some of those were great. Some of those were things that it's hard not to see an upside in the Business Week. And then some others were challenging. There were tensions there. And so I think that's something that we're all going to be trying to navigate and develop for the future. I'm going to actually just stop there because I think it'd be fun to get more of a dialogue moving and say I appreciate the chance to be here and explore what could lie around the corner.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. That was really great. And yeah, both of you gave us a lot of food for thought. So I thought maybe I'd start out with just jotting down a few questions while you guys are talking. I thought I'd start us off with a few questions before we move on to audience questions. So Ambassador Rao mentioned, that 70% of these H-1B visas are going to workers from India. And, if you look at computer scientists coming to the US, that fraction is even higher. So I was just wondering what the two of you thought was, why India? Why is India really such a large center of high-tech workers to the US since the early 1990s? What is so special about India? Why didn't other countries play the same role? And can other countries also figure out how to play this role? I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe Ambassador Rao, if you want to, let us, if you have any thoughts on why India, what was so special about India at this time, really?
Well, I think the ecosystem, Gaurav, in India encourages young people to go into science education. When you're in high school, there is a premium placed on doing, for instance, physics, chemistry, and mathematics, for instance. And not many people, hardly anybody wants to go into humanities. I remember when I was growing up and I was very intent on being a diplomat and joining the Foreign Service. And I had to have this long argument with my mom and dad about why I wanted to do humanities and didn't want to do science. Of course, they were progressive enough, very progressive parents, and they agreed to what I wanted, and that's the reason where I am today. But a lot of the very brightest students went into science, the science stream, as it's called in India. And there is also a great premium placed on, apart from medical education, that is becoming a doctor, placed on becoming an engineer. And in engineering today, it's the premium is really on electronics engineering, on computer engineering, and all the old streams like civil engineering or aeronautics engineering or mining engineering or chemical engineering. Not many people want to go into that. And one of the big complaints about one of our largest engineering firms, Larsen and Toubro, is that they can't find enough civil engineers, and infrastructure is such a big priority for India today. But everybody wants to go into computer engineering, and a lot of people who do civil and mining and other engineering streams also want to go into computer engineering, and they get kind of retrained by the companies when they're hired. The other thing is of course, the quality. I mean, we're producing 1.2 to 2 million engineers, and even if you have a 50% discount, 50% of those numbers are really good engineers. The quality of professionals we're producing is also, I think, extremely attractive for companies that want to hire, not only in India, but also abroad. And then we bring the English language skills also, which is something that China or Japan doesn't have, despite their impressive, imposing skills in technology. So for all these reasons, and I think and as I mentioned, the ability to diversify, to jump between different technologies, and the mathematics skills that we have, I think all that makes for India to be a formidable force in this field. Other countries like the Philippines and Indonesia and Southeast Asian countries, have also made advances, especially, when it comes to some business outsourcing and, the centers that you set up to service companies in the United States, the call centers and things. India has I think, graduated from that level, but I think business outsourcing will continue to be important. The global development centers will be important. And then the fact is that the US doesn't produce enough engineers. The numbers you produce, I just had the figures, I just jotted down the figures. Now, China produces 4.7 million engineers a year. India produces, according to these statistics, 2.6 million engineers a year. The US produces 568,000 engineers a year. That's the figure I have, and Russia 561,000 engineers a year. But we're not like China. I'm afraid that speed of implementation that they have, they build an equivalent of one university a week. And 40% of Chinese graduates in 2013 had STEM degrees. So what countries need to produce is superstar scientific talent. I think that's the only way forward.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, even my parents were always like, I needed to do science, and all my friends went to the IITs and everything. Bill, any thoughts on why India?
I would first echo and double down on many things Ambassador Rao suggested. And the one I'd add one maybe more that was just a nice timing. India's emerging economy started to really increase GDP per capita, and especially among sort of some of the upper income levels, started to hit a level where you would think a lot more about sending your kids abroad for study or pursuing work abroad. And we've seen that in very low levels of development, it's very difficult for anyone but a very small part of the upper class to go abroad for study and kind of start that kind of chain. India was well-timed and had development levels that facilitated that. The other thing I would just maybe take us a little bit just for a minute outside the US, just to emphasize some of those skill developments and the exact kind of levels of production in India and as well as China elsewhere. One of the very interesting companies in Japan, Rakuten, which is one of their large e-commerce platform providers and so forth. Yeah, I think it's probably now a decade ago, roughly, imposed English language being throughout their Japanese facilities. Everything went in English. And it's a memorable story in part because they had this kind of cold turkey turnover. One day it was all in Japanese, and then the next day every sign went in English, every meeting was in English, everything was in English. And ultimately they had to, people had to pass kind of proficiency exams around this. And the underlying reason that their CEO, who was an HBS graduate, pushed this was first, there were two. First, they wanted to be a global player. They didn't want to just be a Japanese player. But second, even in the Japanese world, when you looked at the numbers and the number of people that they wanted to hire for top quality science and engineering and so forth work, Japan's market was just becoming like their graduating population was like less than now 1% of the world total. And so this, by adopting a platform that was more like a US with the English language and so forth, they were going to try to bring in global talent, including from India as well. So you might see other countries trying to replicate these conditions, especially as all of these young talent people emerge. I'll end with one kind of thing that I think shocks many people in the West when they hear it. If you look out about 10 years, I think it's this roughly 2030 kind of time frame, India and China will each account for about 25% of young college graduates, so those that are like between 25 and 34 years old, among the whole set of G20 countries, so the OECD and G20 countries. Western Europe and North America are going to add up at that point to about 20%. So we're going to be less as a combined, and it's like, UK, Germany, like all of us are going to be less just due to our aging demographics and the fact that India and China are still very much on some of these upswings. So you have a lot of people trying to increasingly appreciate how they're either going to set up one of those centers in India to access that talent or try to be able to attract some of it to their locations.
Yeah, and if I may just add here also that the Indian students who study in the US today in the STEM field, now if they're not able to, let's say, work in the US and have to come back to India and look for jobs here, they are going to be at a disadvantage really in terms of the jobs they get, because Indian students studying on Indian campuses in Indian universities are being recruited from the campus or from the campuses by, the leading Indian companies. So they have an advantage because they're hired straight off, and students returning from the US with a US degree may not, that premium may not be enjoyed by them. So that they are at a disadvantage on both fronts, really. So we have to keep that in mind also. I think migration, helps talent, and, the essence of being innovation driven, and I'm quoting the Chinese Communist Party here, the essence of being innovation driven is being talent driven. I think Bill would agree with that.
Thank you. Yeah, and so you both talked about students, and engineering students played a pretty important role, and we talk about how these students had such a big impact on the tech sector and the labor markets in many ways, and innovation and entrepreneurship. But I'd be a bit remiss about the fact that many of us here are in universities, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, when I think of high skill migration, I also think of just student flows and how that affects the higher education sector. Maybe both in the US and in India. How does it affect US universities? How does it affect research production at US universities? I don't know if you have any thoughts really on kind of the role that students directly are playing in the university sector, even before they kind of join the tech sector down the line. I don't know, Bill, if you want to start us off with your thoughts on that.
Gaurav, I'm happy to start, although I got to candidly say almost all of my comments are related to your academic papers. So I feel a little bit like I'm going to get something wrong when put on the spot here, but I've been deeply influenced by your particular work here. Let's start with one really important thing from the university side, which is foreign students writ large, of which, again, Indian students are, I think, 17% of that total, have become really essential financial engines for U.S. universities. And we have a number of, private schools, but especially the public schools, the state schools, have faced increasing enrollment counts and decreasing allocations that are coming from their local state governments for this. And foreign students are one way that you keep the lights on and you pay the bills. And Gaurav has some excellent work that shows that the more you have decreases in state level appropriations, the more likely you're going to see this shift to foreign students. And that's something that clearly during the Trump administration and kind of the question marks that were raised about the future of U.S. policy towards immigration, there was definitely a tapering and in some cases even a decline in foreign student enrollments. We'll see as the new administration takes over whether the students are going to be able to come back and you get COVID and other kinds of things. But the other thing you're going to increasingly face is most states are going to have smaller tax revenues in the years ahead as a consequence of COVID. And that could again lead to pressure on university presidents to say, if I can bring in some out of state and out of country students, that's going to help me pay the bills. The second thing, which is again is pulling from your work as being some of the best to catalog this, is just around the whole OPT program and the fact that we are producing lots of graduates that are then trying to find some way to hold themselves in the U.S. until they can get an H-1B degree, or not degree, H-1B visa. And I sometimes like to liken this to the, kind of several sort of pipes of different levels that are trying to fit together. And at the university level, you have a pipe that can be as big as the universities want it. The core visa categories don't have a limit, a cap on the number. And so universities have increasingly been increasing those. And that sort of flow is trying to next fit into a pipe that is relatively rigid in size and fixed and count. And we have all sorts of workarounds that we've been trying to put into place to band-aid the system together. But from a country's perspective, the US's perspective, we need to do a lot better job of matching the relative flows of and visa categories and talent levels together, because it's putting a lot of strain on the universities to kind of keep that system intact until we can get some reform.
Add to what Bill just said, I think the US needs to tap the talent that is coming from India, use the best of our best, and research centers need to be set up, the India innovation centers that key American firms have set up in India. And given the mutual trust between our two countries, I think you should use that trust as a key factor. Some people say, do you need a new technology visa, perhaps, or a new, like the UK has a global talent visa, for instance. But India's talent pool is unique, and many multinationals, like in the old days, I'm talking of the 2000-2004 phase, when you had the NDA government, the government headed by Prime Minister Vajpayee. A lot of multinationals had set up laboratories in our IITs, for instance. I don't know how well they function now, but that excitement is not there today. Leaders from abroad came to our tech hubs, they spoke, and everybody recalls Prime Minister Vajpayee's words. And I'm translating from Hindi. He said, in India, we speak of the river Ganga and the river Yamuna, the confluence of these two rivers. But in these institutions, we speak of the joint coming together of Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, and goddess Saraswati, the goddess of learning. And that's the confluence you see and the prospects of the confluence you see in our leading engineering institutions. So the talent is here in India, but America has to extend the hand.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao and Bill. I also wanted to get your thoughts a little bit on, Ambassador Rao mentioned COVID and how that's really changed the rules of the game in many ways. COVID has maybe told us a little bit about maybe we don't even need to send people abroad. Maybe we can maybe a lot of the work can be remotely outsourced. Yet, there's a lot of good research, a lot of it by Bill on talent clusters and why sometimes it's good to have people actually be in Silicon Valley, and that leads to a lot of innovation. So I wonder, if you had any thoughts on what are the lessons really that COVID has taught us about this relationship between migration and talent clusters, and where production needs to take place. Does it still need to take place in these tech clusters, or can we actually, did COVID actually tell us that no, it's fine, we can actually be in our homes somewhere on the other side of the world and do the work?
I'm happy to start and then and have Ambassador Rao come after this. Gaurav, I think we still have to learn a little bit more. I think we still have to kind of observe what's going to happen over the next few years. Let me take us back to this time last year. So a couple weeks before all hell's going to really break loose on a global level. And at that moment, the real estate prices, which are probably the best indicator of the value that you're placing on spots, first, for those leading clusters relative to the rest of the country, the differences had never been higher. And then second, if you had gone inside like the Boston area, and you had looked at the premium to be placed right in the middle of Kendall Square, which for everyone is next to MIT, and it's kind of the biotech startup hub, those differences relative to other parts of the Boston area had never been higher than they are. We've certainly challenged a lot of that. But if and I have every reason to believe, and certainly the rental prices have since kind of come down, indicating that there is a big rethink that's happening around the premium of place. There's a couple things that give me some pause for fully endorsing that we're moving to a work from anywhere type of environment. First, when I talk to business leaders, innovation remains one of the hardest things to do in a work from anywhere type of environment. There's something about all of us being uniquely at a whiteboard and working on something that it's just hard to replicate outside. Plus other things like the serendipity that Apple tried to build into its campuses. That's not as easily replicated in a Zoom-based world, and so on and so forth. So there are some of those things that the technology clearly has changed our priors on many forms of collaboration, and I think we'll have a lot more of me piping myself into an event in San Diego versus going on a red-eye flight to be there. But I think in other places we have to see a little bit further how this is going to transform itself. And the second thing that I would highlight is that in other settings, or the second just kind of warning sign for not overly indexing on a work from anywhere environment, in other settings where we have developed technology that is, quote, weightless, what we often find is that it has actually reinforced the value of place as much as it has distributed out. And like the easy example I like to give on that is, if I ask you what was the #1 destination of emails from Harvard Business School, and I gave a little dramatic pause, I'd quickly say it's Harvard Business School. And in fact, the #1 destination of emails from the second floor of the Rock Center, where I traditionally work, is the second floor of the Rock Center. Same is true for phone calls. Like Just because something can be done anywhere, what we sometimes kind of ironically find is that it increases the value of us being together for at least some period of time, so that we can develop those bonds and collaborations in this kind of, looking like that with each other, that then we can distribute around the world, and we can all go to different places and work on problems. So I'm not one that I'm nowhere close to endorsing a view that Silicon Valley or the clusters are going away. They are going to have a very different composition, and kind of God, I hope so, because those places were bursting at the seams. There were so many challenges to housing, so many challenges towards the interaction with the local, traditional local populations, and what people thought of as being the future of neighborhoods, and the way things, kind of that taste that places had, but then is that going to be consistent for the future? I think it'd be great if we can find a way to retain some of that power and potential, and it's going to be on a more global basis, including Bangalore and London and elsewhere, but then also redistribute more of that work and more of those opportunities back outwards. And that would not only help the clusters, I think it would help geopolitically in the US, not having 28 states, add up to be the same as what is being done in the Valley. We could get a lot more political support behind immigration reform if those were being spread more broadly.
I completely agree with what Bill has to say. I really have nothing to add, but to say that it has to be a kind of mix and match world. Many people working remotely, but you will still need a supply of talent which is physically in place where a lot of this needs to be done. And so on the one hand, you have a dispersal of talent, but on the other hand, you also need a physical concentration of talent that creates, that critical mass and that sort of divine inspiration for innovation.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Bert. I think I'd like to move to some audience questions at this time. So Dean Peter Kavi has this question, more so for Ambassador Rao. Does Ambassador Rao think that India would be willing to do some significant trade liberalization in services? Traditionally in the past, we've been a bit closed on the service sector. So we've been skeptical about making these commitments. What do you see going forward? Would we be willing to do this kind of trade liberalization in services?
Well, I'm not really involved in the policy-making processes, and there is a saying, in Urdu in India, which says, "Dilli dur ast," which means Delhi is very far away from where I am currently in Bangalore, literally 1,500 miles or so. But yes, but I think the political climate in the India-US relationship today is very positive and should inspire both sides, I think, to break barriers as far as trade and services and technology is concerned. A lot will depend on the focus and concentration also that the Biden administration is able to give to these issues, given your domestic priorities today. But Indian IT companies, for instance, technology companies, really want to see more trade in services from India. Like you have trade in goods from the United States coming into India, we'd like to see more trade in services going towards the United States. The other thing is, of course, also reform of the WTO. There's a lot needed to be done in these particular fields. So I hope that, within the WTO, within the G20, we'll see more of an inclination to look at how we can reform trade in these critical areas.
Let me also ask a quick question from Arindam Bhattacharya. Ambassador Rao described this balkanization of the physical supply chains that we have right now. But the service supply chains are becoming increasingly global. And so Arindam's question really is that, isn't there a possibility that this balkanization of data and standards could do the same thing to these service value chains? I don't know, Bill, if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't have a very strong prior about how that's going to go. I think we are seeing a lot of challenges in how the world wants to approach internet and data standards and various corridors. Most of the organizations that I've worked with or kind of been able to look over their shoulder are preparing multiple scenarios for the future because it's difficult to appreciate whether you're going to have two main blocks, whether you're going to overcome some of these differences. And yet we've all learned the sensitivity of supply chains in the last year. And so carrying that logic forward, they want to make sure they have multiple sourcing strategies. Ideally, they're consistent with all scenarios, but would be able to withstand whatever happens in terms of these standards and regulations.
Ambassador, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I'd like to, I agree that the possibility of balkanization, even in the field of data, given the tensions between China and the United States, the way that proceeds, that could become a possibility. But as I said, India is going to veer more to the Western technology alignment in the future. So, even if we don't have alliances, as it's always said, India will have alignments, and it's issue-based alignments, issue-based coalitions. And so strategic autonomy being practiced in a more open way, open strategic autonomy. We will make the choices that safeguard our interest. And those choices really are inclined towards the Western group of countries. So, so that really points to the need, as I mentioned, to more, easing of barriers in regard to bilateral Indo-US trade in technology, because it enhances security, it enhances our strategic interests. So trade in infotech, in e-commerce, what Paula Stern spoke about, a bilateral India-US IT sector agreement, because it's going to benefit many other sectors. And I mentioned defense and flow of people, banking, aerospace, science and technology, infrastructure. So we really need to eliminate tariffs and regulatory mechanisms so as to promote harmonization that benefits trade.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to quickly shift towards the end of our discussion. Moved quickly about what does all of this tell us about the best ways to reform in some ways immigration policy. I know Bill had a lot of thoughts on that in his book, and Ambassador Rao mentioned how the Trump administration's wage criteria and salary caps kind of might have been a bad idea. And there were some audience questions as such related to this. What about points-based systems? Are there better systems out there moving forward? How do these kinds of arbitrariness of the Trump policies, how would that then affect the future flows of migrants? Just the fact that there's this uncertainty given the arbitrary nature of certain executive orders that can be done. So yeah, any thoughts really on what is the best way to reform this immigration policy for high-skilled migrants in any way? So I don't know, whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll give it a first shot, and then Ambassador Rao can take up from there. And Gaurav, I don't know how long you're planning for this session to go, but you opened up a Pandora's box with that one. Let me start with I guess my mental framing of kind of what affects high-skill migration choices, or what are the implications that the Trump administration had? What are the implications that a Biden administration could change, and so forth? And I think one thing is to look at the actual policies that are on the book and some of the executive orders and some of the reforms that have to go through Congress and similar. And those things are sometimes difficult to change, take some time. Obviously, EOs can go faster than other stuff. Then there is the ways that policies are applied. And a lot of the questions about, how we were processing, immigration during the last 4 years was often about like requests for evidence, RFEs, like the enforcement of that became more hostile during the administration. And then there's kind of like this big thing over here, which is just what's the overall tone? What's the level of kind of confidence that the U.S. is sharing outwards, towards others? And that's probably a place where we did, the most to kind of dampen the luster that the U.S. historically would have had in this space. And so the administration can obviously be working across all of these things. And Biden has very early on in his presidency signaled, we want to restore back that luster and try to become more of that shining light. And then over on the other side, start to undo some of the EOs and then also put some proposals in place. And I guess where that leads me to is to think, gosh, I would love to believe that we could have something of even semi-comprehensive immigration reform, which has been holding up all kinds of reform on high-skilled, low-skilled kinds of stuff. That has had, more than a decade now of frustration. And you think it might happen now, and then it doesn't make it through Congress, doesn't make it through the votes and so forth. In my book, I tried to take a relatively safe route, I think, of only arguing for reforms in the broad structure of what we've set up, including things like we should have an immigrant entrepreneur visa, which would really impact, India and kind of its connections to U.S. innovation and so forth. We should try to think about how to make the H-1B program much better off than where it is right now, including reforming selection mechanisms, getting rid of lotteries, having it more indexed to the size of the economy, those types of questions. And then also the student kind of issues we came before. And then there's a level of kind of trying to even think more optimistically, hopefully, maybe crazily about the U.S. moving in a way towards more skilled-based immigration. You could think of about having a point system. You could have other kinds of approaches. But it's not clear to me that we're ever going to, in the near term, create that kind of coalition or understanding about what that could be. All that to come back to kind of my final big worry about the U.S.'s position and global talent. Because let's say that the Biden administration does some nice things here in terms of trying to help the immigration picture get cleaned up. You still have in the U.S. a country that is fundamentally on a knife's edge. It's like every election that we're going to go into at the president for a while to come is more or less not going to be decided before election night, at least in theory. And you can look from today and say we just had President Biden be elected and replace President Trump. But if you look out to 2024, is it going to be, President Trump again? Is it going to be, President Cotton from Arkansas? Is it going to be Kamala Harris, who becomes president? Like, all of those are legitimate possibilities. And so as a consequence, the U.S. may be in a period of time where, unfortunately, we are jerking back and forth between quite extreme positions in the White House over relatively short time intervals. And that leaves me, that's the scariest thing for me, because there's one thing that my wife was an H-1B and she went through all these processes, became a citizen. I can affirm to you that the U.S. immigration system has never been user-friendly. It has never been something that was just like, hey, come on, here's the red carpet that we roll out and so forth. But it was always a relatively predictable process. And it was always something that people were willing to put up with some long lines and some waits, and certainly Indian waits are awful in timeframes, but they were able to put up with a lot in order to, be kind of clear about what could be on the other side. And it's an investment. And the more that you introduce uncertainty into an investment, whether you're opening up a chemical plant or whether you are buying a home or starting to date somebody, the more you introduce uncertainty, the less likely that investment becomes. And unfortunately, what I can't quite fully resolve in my head is how we get to a point where an immigrant global talent could look at the US and not feel a dreaded sense of uncertainty about whatever's in place right now could be very different in a few years' time.
Thank you. I have very little to add to what Bill said, but I think this uncertainty factor, which kind of infuses this scenario today, must be dealt with. And you do need immigration reform in the United States, and you need to make the process more user-friendly. I was just speaking to an immigration lawyer here in Bangalore who does a lot of H-1B visa work, and he was saying that just the act of filing for an H-1B visa is so cumbersome. The amount of paperwork, it can't be done digitally. You have to submit, paperwork, and it could be 300 to 350 pages of material that you need to attach to your application. So that certainly needs to be simplified. And I think basically also at the political level, I think there needs to be awareness and sensitivity to the fact that there is going to be a globalization of services that you have to come to terms with. There has to be talent that the US allows to come in to the country in order to support innovation, in order to strengthen those talent clusters across, those 28 states that Bill spoke about. And, there is going to be a digital acceleration in the world. I mean, you're seeing that in a post-pandemic situation. So you have to adjust and create policies that are in tune with that situation, that environment you see around. So the country needs talent. And in President Biden, I think you have somebody who's much more measured, much more logical on this issue than his predecessor. So I hope the United States will continue to reap those advantages that it has today as far as attracting talent is concerned. Its position on the global competitive index is so high when you compare it to China and Russia. So I hope that will happen, and that will sustain also this partnership between India and the United States in many areas.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That definitely hit a personal note, given all the paperwork that I myself have had to deal with this year. But I think we might be, I see Josh and John are back. I think that means we may be at time. Is that right, Josh?
We have a few more minutes if you wanna field one more question, but
yeah. So
I'm happy to lob one in.
Yeah, sure, Josh, go for it.
So I wanted to come back to this idea of physical distance and clusters and the movement of people versus the movement of ideas. And I wanted to just ask what I think is a slightly nuanced question for Bill and Ambassador Rao, which is, do we have a sense for how important that physical proximity is for the consummation of relationships versus the continuation of relationships? Because that has implications. I think if that differs, then that has implications not just for where people need to be, but where they need to be in a life cycle of the firm or their relationship with the firm. And I haven't heard anyone really speak much of that. So maybe we don't know the answer, but I'd love to hear your speculation.
I think the proximity is most important in the initial development of the relationship. And we find relationships that are often then able to be bridged across distance effectively. One empirical piece of evidence around that actually came from the predecessor, the early form of the internet called BitNet. And there was a study that was able to look at the rollout of BitNet and how it changed collaboration relationships. And the main thing that allowed over greater distance was when a thesis advisor was working with a graduate student And historically, that relationship would have been severed by the distance, but post BitNet, it was able to be maintained and be able to do collaboration in publishing. So at least that's one example of that the technology allowed us to distribute the work out more broadly. And then the kind of the more anecdotal evidence would be one of the big challenges that companies are working through right now is how to onboard and how to consummate relationships in a virtual world. It was, in many respects, some organizations got a false positive as to how easy this would be because they took an existing team and they moved it offline. And that works well because you and I already know each other and we have, I know your quirks. I know all of, when I see you kind of nod or something like that, I know what that really means. And there's a challenge for us to rebuild that into companies right now.
I don't have any examples to cite in this field. I think we'll have to see how the post-pandemic situation pans out, but I think it'll have to be, not a restoration completely of the world as we knew it and the way people worked and those to and fro activities that you saw. I think it'll have to be a mix and match. You will have people working from home, from where their companies are actually physically located, and also talent clusters that you need to create and that are predicated on more physical contact and proceed on those lines. So it'll really have to be a mix of that. But as I said, I'm not an expert on this issue and I cannot predict the future. I don't know what direction it will take, but in practical terms, I think you will have to have a combination, a balancing of both these worlds that we see. So it's a shared future.
And let me add one just addendum, just as a piece that was certainly pre-COVID very relevant, and I suspect it will still be quite relevant afterwards. Specifically not me, young talent. So often at the hub of these innovations, that kind of digital talent that's able to do so much that companies are trying to access. A lot of what was being pushed into talent clusters was the desire of that young talent to be in those locations. That was the driving force behind, for example, the movement out of Silicon Valley of a lot of where people were living up into San Francisco proper. And likewise, from the outskirts of Boston, Route 128 used to be the tech hubs, and then it goes into Kendall Square around that. And I suspect that once we open up a few more COVID restrictions, there's a lot of young people that want to get back to living that life again. And that is beyond just the conservation. That's going to be something that's, again, a magnet that's going to draw the businesses to be where that talent is.
And I think that the challenge that we face is that while we have a very highly interconnected world, thanks to technology, and this is what somebody from Bangladesh said recently, we have an interconnected world on the technology front, but on a philosophical and ideological level, it's never been as disconnected. And I don't think that the pandemic has changed that. So the real crux of the thing is leadership. And if leadership is disjointed, then, we have problems to deal with. So I hope the insularity and the tendency to polarization becomes less, because that's really going to be counterproductive.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. We're past time. The conversation was so exciting that I definitely lost track of time. So let me just thank Ambassador Rao and Bill again. This was really like an enthralling conversation. So very important, both as we see policy changing. Again, today there was a new proclamation as well. So things are changing rapidly, at a time like this where we need technology more than ever. We realized this last year that it really played a big important role in our lives, that this is like a really important part of moving forward. So thank you so much, Ambassador Rao and Bill, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you to
Thank you.
everybody.
Great.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone who could join us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Yes, absolutely. Good night, everyone.